X. The courtroom didn't go quiet when Selene Adjei walked in. It laughed. X. Not all at once. It started with the clerk, who looked up from his desk, looked back down, then looked up again. Then the opposing counsel leaned over to his junior and said something low. And the junior smiled. And then a few people in the gallery caught on, and the sound moved through the room like a wave, unhurried, inevitable. X. Selene was 24 years old. She was wearing her mother's blazer, navy, slightly too wide in the shoulders, and she was carrying a manila folder held shut with a rubber band because she didn't own a briefcase. She had a notebook under her arm, black cover, coil-bound, the kind you buy at Dollarama for $1.99. X. She sat down at the plaintiff's table and placed the folder in front of her and the notebook beside it. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at opposing counsel. She looked straight ahead at the bench where Judge Harold Forsyth had not yet entered, and she waited. X. She had learned how to wait in Petawawa. 12 weeks of basic, 2 tours, 4 years total in uniform before a roadside incident outside Kandahar took a piece of her left knee and sent her home on a medical discharge. She had spent 6 months in physiotherapy at CFB Kingston, learning to walk without a limp. She had not cried once during that process, not because she was tough, she was, but that wasn't the reason, but because she had decided the knee didn't deserve her tears. X. This was the same logic she applied to the courtroom. The laughing didn't deserve her attention. X. What deserved her attention was the single question she had been turning over in her mind for 11 days. The question she had written in the back of the coil-bound notebook and stared at every morning with her coffee going cold beside her at the kitchen table of her grandmother's house on Elgin Street in Brockville, Ontario. X. She hadn't told anyone about the question. Not her aunt, not her cousin Theo, who kept calling from Ottawa, asking if she needed help, if she'd found a lawyer, if she understood what she was up against. She had told Theo the same thing each time. I understand exactly what I'm up against. X. What she was up against was a man named Douglas Firth. X. Douglas Firth was 61 years old, a property developer from Kingston who had been doing business in the Leeds and Grenville corridor for the better part of 3 decades. He had a lawyer named Crawford, first name Alistair, the kind of man who wore cufflinks on a Tuesday, and Crawford had a junior named whatever his name was, who was currently smiling at the sight of Selene's Dollarama notebook. X. Douglas Firth wanted the house on Elgin Street. X. More specifically, Douglas Firth claimed he already owned the house on Elgin Street, and that Selene's grandmother, Selene Adjei, had signed it over to him 14 months ago as partial settlement of a debt. He had paperwork, he had a signed agreement, he had a notarized transfer of title. X. What he did not have, Selene believed, was the truth. X. Selene Adjei was 78 years old and had lived in Brockville since 1987. She had come from Kumasi with 2 suitcases and a nursing degree, and she had worked 31 years at Brockville General before retiring. She had bought the house on Elgin Street in 1994 for $87,000, the year Selene's mother was finishing nursing school at Queen's. She had painted the shutters green herself. She had planted the garden herself. X. She had lived alone in that house for 9 years since Selene's grandfather, Theodore Sr., had passed from a stroke. X. She was not a woman who signed things she didn't understand. X. That was the first thing Selene had said to her grandmother when the eviction notice arrived, when Selene had driven the 3 hours from Ottawa at 11 at night and found Vivienne at the kitchen table with the papers spread in front of her and her hands folded on top of them, very still. X. Grandma, did you sign something? X. Vivienne had looked at her for a long moment. I signed a paper for that man. He told me it was about the boundary fence. He said there was a survey dispute, and I needed to sign to keep things from going to court. X. When? X. April of last year. He came to the door with a notary. X. Did you read it? X. Vivienne's hands tightened on the papers. I asked him to explain it to me. He said it was standard. He was very kind. He had a kind voice. She paused. I should have read it. X. Selene had reached across the table and put her hand over her grandmother's. She did not say it's okay. She did not say, don't worry. She said, tell me everything you remember about that day. X. It had taken 4 hours. By the time Vivienne had gone to bed, Selene had filled 11 pages of a brand new notebook. X. The lawyers she called over the following 3 weeks were not unkind. They were careful. 2 of them used the same phrase, almost word for word. Given the notarized documentation, The burden of proof will be significant. One of them quoted a retainer of $8,000 to start. One of them said he could take it on contingency but would need 60% of any award. One told her plainly that he thought the case was unwinnable and he didn't want to take her money. Selene thanked each of them. She wrote their names and opinions in the notebook. Then she went to the Brockville Public Library and she started reading. She read the Ontario Evidence Act. She read sections of the Land Titles Act. She read 3 Court of Appeal decisions on undue influence in property transfers involving elderly plaintiffs. She read an academic paper on notarial fraud published by a professor at Osgood. She read it twice because she didn't understand 2 of the footnotes the first time. She filled the notebook. Then she bought another one. Theo called from Ottawa and said, "Selene, you cannot represent Grandma in court. You're not a lawyer." In small claims, anyone can represent a party. This isn't small claims, but I filed under the simplified procedure rules. I have the right to act as agent. You learned that in the last 2 weeks. I learned fast. Selene. Theo, I need you to not call me for the next 10 days. He had called anyway. She had let it go to voicemail. Here is the thing about Douglas Firth that Selene had noticed on page 47 of the disclosure package his lawyer's office had sent over, which she had read on the floor of Vivienne's living room, with every page laid out around her in order. The notary's name was Gerald Price. Gerald Price was a notary public registered in Ontario. His stamp was on the transfer document. His signature confirmed that Selene Adjei had appeared before him and signed in his presence and appeared to understand the nature of the document. Gerald Price had been a notary public registered in Ontario since 2011. His registration had lapsed in February of the previous year, 2 months before the date on the transfer document. Selene had found this by going to the Law Society of Ontario's public registry and typing in his name. It had taken less than 4 minutes. She had stared at the screen for a very long time. Then she had opened the notebook to the back page and written one question. She had not written it down because she needed to remember it. She had written it down because she wanted to see what it looked like. Because she had a superstition, left over from the army, that some things needed to be committed to paper before they became real. The question was, on the date of February 18th of last year, was Gerald Price a registered notary public in the province of Ontario? That was it. That was the whole question. 7 seconds to ask, 47 days of work to arrive at. Judge Harold Forsyth entered at 9:14. He was a compact man in his mid-60s with reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and when he sat down and surveyed the courtroom and his eyes moved from Crawford's side of the room, 2 lawyers, a junior, a paralegal, a banker's box of files. To Selene's side of the room, 1 young woman, a folder, a notebook. Something moved across his face. Not amusement. Something more careful than that. "Mrs. Adjei," he said, "you're acting as agent for the plaintiff?" "Yes, Your Honor." "You understand the nature of these proceedings?" "I do, Your Honor." He studied her for a moment. "Very well, Mr. Crawford, you may proceed." Crawford was good. Selene gave him that. He was organized and measured, and he knew exactly what he was doing. He put the transfer document into evidence and walked through it methodically. The date, the parties, the consideration paid, the signature, the notarial stamp. He called a woman from Firth's office who testified about the original survey dispute that had prompted the meeting. He called a surveyor who testified about the boundary in question. He was building a wall, brick by brick, and it was a very solid wall. During all of it, Selene wrote in the notebook. Not frantically, steadily. She wrote down times and names and phrases that didn't match other things she'd written down. At one point, Crawford glanced over at her. She didn't look up. At the lunch break, a woman from the gallery touched her arm in the hallway and said, "Are you really doing this by yourself, honey?" Selene said yes. The woman said, "God bless you." Selene went to the bathroom and ate a granola bar she'd brought in her coat pocket and drank water from the tap and looked at herself in the mirror for about 30 seconds. She looked tired. She'd been sleeping 4 hours a night for 2 weeks. Her knee ached from the wooden chair. She looked like someone who had no business being in that courtroom. She went back in and sat down. The afternoon session was Crawford's closing before Selene's turn. He was thorough. He emphasized the notarial certification 3 times. He said the words legally binding 5 times. He said the word unambiguous twice, which Selene thought was interesting, because in her experience, people only called things unambiguous when they were worried someone might find them ambiguous. When it was her turn, she stood up. The gallery had thinned out a bit after lunch. Vivienne was there in the second row in her good coat, sitting very straight. Selene looked at her once. Vivienne gave her a single, small nod. Selene turned back to the bench. Your Honor, she said, the defense has placed significant weight on the notarial certification of this transfer document. The notarial stamp is, as Mr. Crawford described it, the cornerstone of the document's legal validity. I agree that this is correct. A notarized document carries legal weight precisely because a registered notary public has confirmed that the signing party appeared in person and understood what they were signing. Crawford was watching her with the specific expression of a man who is professionally required to take you seriously but has not yet been given a personal reason to. I would like to ask Mr. Crawford, Selene continued, to confirm for the court the registration status of the notary who stamped this document. Crawford blinked. I don't see what. Mr. Crawford, Judge Forsyth's voice was mild. Please allow Ms. Adjei to proceed. Selene set a single piece of paper on the clerk's desk. Your Honor, I'm entering into evidence a printout from the Law Society of Ontario's Public Notary Registry, accessed 2 weeks ago. I'll direct the court to the highlighted section. She waited while the clerk passed it up to the judge. She waited while the judge put on his reading glasses. She waited while the reading glasses settled on his nose, and his eyes moved down the page to the highlighted section. The room was very quiet. Mr. Crawford, Judge Forsyth said in a different voice than before, are you aware of the registration status of Gerald Price? Crawford had received the document now from his junior, who had printed something on his tablet and was holding it for him. Crawford's face had changed. The professional patience was still there. Technically, the architecture of it was intact, but behind it something had shifted, and Selene could see it, because she had spent 4 years learning to read faces that were trying not to show her what they were feeling. Your Honor, Crawford began, there may be. Mr. Crawford. The judge's voice was very calm. On the date of February 18th of last year, was Gerald Price a registered notary public in the province of Ontario? The room heard the silence before Crawford answered. It lasted about 5 seconds. It felt like much longer. Selene did not look away from the bench. She heard Vivienne shift slightly in the row behind her. Your Honor, Crawford said finally, we would need time to verify. The Law Society Registry is publicly accessible, Judge Forsyth said. He looked down at the paper again. His registration lapsed on February 3rd. He took his glasses off. He set them on the desk. He looked at Douglas Firth, who had gone the specific color of a man who has been told very bad news he already knew. That is 46 days before this document was stamped. The gallery woke up. Not loudly, just the way rooms change when something has shifted. A collective breath, a small collective movement, the sound of people leaning forward or back. Crawford was already at his table, speaking quietly to his junior, the quality of the conversation having changed entirely. Douglas Firth was staring at the transfer document in front of him. He was not reading it. He was just staring at it, the way people look at things, when they are trying to decide what they knew and when they knew it. Judge Forsyth was not done. Miss Adjei, he said, and his voice now carried something Selene recognized from her commanding officers. Not warmth, exactly, but a specific form of respect that those people gave out very rarely and very deliberately. Do you have additional submissions? She did. She had prepared for this. She talked for 20 minutes about the conditions under which the document had been presented to Vivienne, about what Vivienne had been told she was signing, about the legal standard for informed consent in property transfers involving elderly plaintiffs. She was not polished. She was not theatrical. She was very specific, and she cited the cases she had found in the library, and when she wasn't sure about something she said so, which Judge Forsyth seemed to find more useful than anything Crawford had done all day. She sat down. Her knee was screaming. She pressed it against the underside of the table and kept her face still. The judgment came 17 days later in writing. Judge Forsyth found that the transfer document was invalid, citing the lapsed notarial registration as fatal to its legal standing. He further found evidence suggestive of misrepresentation in how the document had been presented to Vivienne, though he declined to rule on fraud directly, noting that matter might be considered in a separate proceeding. There was, in other words, a clear suggestion in the judgment that Douglas Firth's conduct warranted further examination. 3 months later, Selene learned from a local paper that the Ontario Provincial Police had opened a fraud investigation. She learned this from a Google alert she'd set up because Theo had told her she should, and because for once she had listened to Theo. Douglas Firth hired a very expensive criminal defense lawyer. Selene hoped that was uncomfortable for him. The day the judgment arrived, Selene drove to Brockville. It was a Thursday in late November, gray and cold, the kind of Ontario cold that reminds you winter is not coming, but has in fact already arrived and is simply being patient with you. Vivienne made jollof rice, and they ate at the kitchen table, the same table where Selene had sat at 11 at night 3 months ago and looked at her grandmother's hands folded on the eviction papers. The shutters outside the kitchen window were still green. The garden was put to bed for the winter under a layer of straw. They didn't talk about the case much. They talked about Theo, who had finally stopped calling every day and had switched to texting, which was better. They talked about Vivienne's church friends. They talked about the knee, which Selene's physiotherapist had recently described as doing remarkably well considering, which Selene chose to interpret as a compliment. At some point, Vivienne looked at her over the table and said, "I want to know how you found it, the registration thing." I looked it up. You just looked it up. Public registry, Law Society website, free to access. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. That man had 2 lawyers and a paralegal and nobody looked it up. No. Why not? Selene thought about this. She thought about Crawford and his cufflinks and his banker's box and the way he had looked at her notebook and smiled. She thought about the assumption that the document was what it said it was, because it looked like what it said it was, because a man like Douglas Firth wouldn't make an error like that. Because they weren't worried, she said. People stop looking when they're not worried. Vivienne nodded slowly. Then she stood and got the dessert from the counter, chin-chin she'd made that morning, and she set it on the table between them without saying anything else, because Selene Adjei was a woman who understood that some things didn't need a response, only acknowledgement. Outside, the cold had settled in fully. The street was quiet, the way Brockville went quiet in November, every house holding its warmth close. Inside, the kitchen was warm and the shutters were green, and the house on Elgin Street was still exactly where it had always been. I keep thinking about that notebook, the Dollarama one, $1.99. That's what it cost to save a house worth decades of someone's life. Not the notebook itself, obviously, but what Selene put into it. The hours, the library trips, the court decisions she read twice because she didn't understand the footnotes the first time. The question she wrote on the back page not because she needed to remember it, but because she needed it to be real. I've thought about why Crawford didn't find it. He had 2 lawyers, a junior, a paralegal, a banker's box. He had 30 years of experience in that kind of room, and it never occurred to him to type Gerald Price's name into a public registry. 4 minutes. Free to access. He just didn't look. He wasn't worried, and that, I think, is the whole story inside the story. Douglas Firth chose Vivienne because she was elderly and alone and had no money for a lawyer. He chose her because he calculated she couldn't fight back. That calculation wasn't random. It was the logic of someone who has spent years getting away with things, who has learned that the people most worth taking from are the ones least equipped to stop you. That kind of thinking carries its own undoing. It makes you careless. It makes you stop checking. It makes you stamp a document with a notary who hasn't been registered for 46 days and assume nobody will ever look closely enough to notice. Selene looked closely. That's what she did differently, and it wasn't luck. It was a choice she made at 11 at night at her grandmother's kitchen table when she could have just cried about it instead. What strikes me about Selene isn't the legal victory. It's the sequence of decisions that got her there. She could have accepted what the lawyers told her, that the case was unwinnable, that the burden of proof was too high, that she should let it go. She chose instead to treat the problem as solvable in herself as someone capable of solving it. That's not arrogance. That's a kind of moral clarity I find genuinely hard to argue with. X. She believed her grandmother hadn't signed what she thought she signed. She believed that mattered. She went looking for proof that it did. X. There's something in that I want to hold on to. The idea that integrity isn't just about being honest in what you say, it's about being honest in what you do when it's difficult, when no one is watching, when the lawyers have told you to walk away and you're alone in a library at midnight reading the Land Titles Act. X. And the discipline to keep going. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that looks good from the outside. The quiet kind, 4 hours of notes, 11 pages, a second notebook, a Google alert set up months later just in case. X. Vivian kept the house because her granddaughter refused to stop looking. Douglas Firth is under investigation because he assumed she would. X. The things we do in rooms where no one is watching, those are the things that determine what happens in the rooms where everyone is.